9:05 is the time. News Talk 1270 KIML, the radio station. My name is Glenn Woods. And joining us from Cheyenne for their weekly update. This has become kind of like a weekly little thing we've got going here. Maureen, good to see you again. From Wyoming
Great to
Liberty
see you
Group.
too.
Maureen is calling in. Backdrop ready to go. Now, it looks good there with the little logo thing under there. Okay.
But can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you just fine.
Thank goodness.
Thank goodness. Yeah, we were having problems when you were setting that up last time around there. So, okay. Maureen from Wyoming Liberty Group, who gives us updates. And by the way, that page, I keep throwing updates from you guys every time I see an update from you on the new page that I have. That's just regional news, so everybody can know what's going on in Cheyenne. Because when it comes to media, there's not a lot of great media in Wyoming, but Wyoming Liberty Group is walking distance from the Capitol. I had an interview with the governor yesterday, which I'm sorry. I thought a lot of his answers, personally, I thought were evasive, Maureen. I mean, it didn't matter what, especially, and I brought you up by name a couple of times.
No. No wonder I'm on his blacklist.
I guess so, because of, and I had that on my website for a while, the paper that you handed me that showed that these budget cuts are not really budget cuts, not really. And he was talking about 6% or less by the time they get done with it. And I kept asking him, well, isn't this just cuts in the rate of growth? And I brought up a question that I had for you. So, okay, is this next budget going to be bigger or smaller than the last budget? And again, Maureen, I didn't get a straight answer.
Well, right now what's happening is that the House version of the budget and the Senate version of the budget are being essentially reconciled. But from what we can see already, and even with the governor's budget, the amount of spending this next in this biennium will actually be higher than the spending in the last biennium. And the amount of spending in the general fund, which is the fund that essentially our state legislature is basically in charge of, that is going to be higher this time, even with the cuts. So this is essentially like a federal government problem where we've got spending which is so completely out of control that the politicians can't seem to find any way to make real reductions in their budgets. We see some reductions in some places, but we see bigger increases in other places. So at the end of the day, we're spending more and more, and it's just creating the same downward spiral that we're seeing at the federal level.
Right, and I'll go ahead, and now that I'm talking about it, I'll go ahead and put that report that you did up on my website again so everybody can see it, because you have several pages in there where you and some other writers went through one program after the next is actually going to grow rather than reduce. And when I take a look at the rate of growth, I had our Speaker of the House plus one of our senators before they went down to Cheyenne. And they were talking about the fuel tax, which to me, obviously, the fuel tax is going to be rammed right on through. And they just couldn't find anywhere else to cut. To them, it was beyond them. But we've come up with a list of things they could probably get rid of, I'm thinking.
You know, you're right about that. And so today what's happening is that the gas tax, HB 69, is on what they call the consent list at the Senate. That essentially means it's just going to get railroaded through. So all the bills that are on the consent list gets voted on, so they vote yes, and essentially. And then what happens is they go through each one of the bills that are on the consent list, and there's some people can change their votes or not. So we'll know today which senators are going to vote in favor of the gas tax, but essentially it's a done deal. We've known right from the very beginning that if this tax hike made it through the House, it was a done deal in the Senate, and sure enough, people will be sending more of their hard-earned cash to Cheyenne so they can spend it on things like pay hikes for bureaucrats, and in fact, you know, they're talking about it contributing more to the bureaucrat pension plan. And the ironic thing about that is that the employee increase is actually going to be paid for by the taxpayer. So here we have taxpayers, many of whom don't even have a pension, being forced to pay more and more and more into bureaucrat pension plans, and this is just fundamentally wrong.
Well, and let's take a closer look at that, because I had some calls this morning about the fuel tax, and people were asking me, well, is the fuel tax all going to go to the roads? And we've talked about this before, but let's clarify it a little bit. So they raised this fuel tax 10 cents a gallon, and I say fuel because it's not just gasoline.
That's right.
And not all of it gets down. In fact, am I right about 40% actually hits the road?
Well, 40% goes to YDOT for roads, supposedly. Right. And then another actually, no, sorry, 40 million. So the fuel tax is about 71 million. About 40 some million of that goes to YDOT for roads, and the rest of it goes to local governments, supposedly also for roads. It's supposed to be going to roads, but of course, you know, one of the interesting things about YDOT is that we've had a huge problem getting their actual commission budget. So we really have no way to know how much they're spending on salaries, how much they're spending on roads, how much they're spending on this, how much they're spending on that in detail. And I'm working really hard right now with a couple of legislators to try to get that commission budget so that we can start looking at how their expenses have actually changed over time, because they're quite happy to tell us how much they're spending on roads, but they're not telling us how much they're spending on salaries and how much they're spending on their administrative costs. And I think that's a serious fault in oversight on the part of the commission and the governor.
Well, joining me on the video stream right now is Maureen from Wyoming Liberty Group. So can you, any reason why you'd have such a hard time getting a hold of those numbers? I mean, aren't we supposed to be living in sunshine?
Yeah, you really got to wonder. We're actually getting quite the runaround from YDOT, and this is why I've actually tried to get a legislator to help me. And I mean, if I really have to start playing hardball, I'm going to have to start looking more closely at the public records legislation to see what my recourse is going to be because of all of this stonewalling I'm getting. And it's not just YDOT where we're going to have this problem. If this lottery bill passes, we're actually also going to have this problem with the Lottery Corporation. So I was up testifying in front of the Senate Travel Committee against the lottery bill earlier this week, and I found out that this lottery bill is much, much worse than I originally thought. So it is going to create yet another bureaucracy, so that's a move in the wrong direction. We need less government, not more. But any of the rules or any of the meetings about what's going to be secret or whatever this Wyoming Lottery Corporation decides is going to be secret, we won't be able to access that. So here's another bureaucracy of government that's going to be spending our money, or spending money anyway, that it's going to be collecting primarily through lottery ticket sales. But as with the Game and Fish Department, we know that these bureaucracies, they tend to grow and grow and grow. Their expenses get bigger and bigger. Next thing you know, they're coming to looking for general funds. And we're not going to be able to see the decisions that the Wyoming Lottery Corporation makes. This is a really big problem with this bill.
Well, okay, let's take a good look at that, because that looks like another one that, of course, they try to ram things through as fast as possible. And oftentimes what they're telling us compared to what's we were told this is supposed to be a temporary lottery commission to set up a separate corporation, and then at some point the corporation goes away and it runs itself. This is what we're hearing out here, but that's not what they're setting up at all, is it?
No, it's more story time at the legislature. It's a little bit like the discussion on the gas tax. Was it earlier this week? I lose track of the time, you know. We get this story about how, well, you know, people aren't really going to be paying the tax. Well, I don't know who's going to be paying the tax. I mean, YDOT itself has got its fuel administration, like another fuel bureaucracy that collects the fuel tax. Right there on their website, they say that it's definitely determined that the end user, the retail user, is the one who pays the tax. And yet, right in the legislature, we hear this story time about how, oh, no, you know, people aren't actually going to see this tax increase. But the reality is, people are going to be sending more money to Cheyenne, to the legislature, so they're going to spend it on stuff, and that means that people have less money in their own pocket to spend.
All right. So with the lottery, though, now again, this is a temporary corporation. This is what I'm not understanding. That's supposed to go away.
No. There's no temporary. No. There's no temporary corporation. This legislation sets up something called the Wyoming Lottery Corporation, and that will run lottery games, which most likely would be something like Powerball here in the state. It's not going anywhere. It's going to be set up supposedly like the Wyoming Pipeline Corporation, which I haven't taken a close look at, but I have taken a very close look at the Game and Fish Department, which is run under a commission system, which supposedly is supposed to run through its own resources, through the funds that it generates through hunting and fishing licenses. But it needs more money. Why? Because it can't keep control of its spending. Why? Because it's a government bureaucracy, and like any government bureaucracy, I mean, they're like a fungus. They just grow and grow. So we couldn't really expect the Wyoming Lottery Corporation, which is not only going to be a government bureaucracy, it's going to be one that people aren't going to be able to, you know, the media and different groups are not going to be able to take a close look at the decisions these people make or their expenses, because those are going to be they're going to be secret, basically. They're not going to be subject to the same transparency laws as supposedly YDOT is. And even with YDOT that is subject to these transparency laws, we don't seem to be able to get their commission budget. So, I mean, I can only foresee serious problems with this Wyoming Lottery Corporation if this bill passes. So it's really important, if people think that this might be a bad idea, to make sure that they call their senators, because this is on the general file today. And if it passes out of the general file, that means it goes to second reading. If it goes to second reading, that means it goes to third reading. And the next thing you know, we've got more government here in Wyoming.
Okay, now, and that was going to be my next question. How far into this are they? And I hate to have you as an odds caller since we're talking about lotteries, but what are the odds of this going through? The last time when I first saw it, it was just in a committee, but it couldn't make it out of the committee. It's gone a long way, baby. How close are we to getting a lottery in this state?
Well, on Tuesday, the travel committee took a look at it, and some of the House representatives I was talking to were really concerned that it was just a total shoe-in through that committee. But in fact, 2 senators voted against it, Senator Barnard and Senator Christensen, which was actually a big improvement over what a lot of the representatives who were against this bill were concerned about. Now it's going to general file. So what that means that it's sort of on the list for first reading. They may get to it or not today. And if they don't get it today, well, they may get it to tomorrow. And if they don't, I think they've got till, I think it's February 21st to get through to get through the first reading. So if it doesn't get through by the 21st, that means it's dead. But if it does get through, that means then it goes to second reading. Second reading usually is just a shoe through, and then we'll have another chance to kill it in third reading. But if it doesn't get killed then we have a lottery corporation here in Wyoming.
Right. And of course the worry is every single year it gets a little bit closer, doesn't it? All right. More with Maureen from Wyoming Liberty in just a moment. Time is 9:20, 682-1270. The phone number 307-682-1270. If you're outside the area code, and joining me from Cheyenne is Maureen from Wyoming Liberty Group. What else, Maureen, do we have to keep an eye on? God, there's so much this time around that we have to keep an eye on. I mean, seriously, this has got to be one of the worst legislative sessions I've seen in years, or is it just me overreacting?
No, a lot of people are pretty negative about how things have been working out here. I mean, they're one of the things that are, it's a couple of bills that have the legislature interfering with contracts between employers and employees have to do with tipping and vacation, and that was in the paper today. So there was one tip bill that was pretty good, because what was happening is that restaurants you know how you go to a restaurant sometimes and you're in a big group, and if they'll add 15% to that, which I find personally actually quite annoying. But what was happening is that the restaurants, and so the people who were earning the tips were having to pay a sales tax on that. So still, luckily to this day, we have no income tax here. So essentially they were being wrongly taxed. So that one I think went through. But then what happened is that for some reason there was another tip bill that said that, you know, tips had to be distributed in a certain way. Now, it's not for government to be telling employers and employees how they have to distribute their tips. So this one is going forward. And then there was another weird one about vacation time. Now, I don't know, I mean, I've worked in lots of different jobs. When I leave, what I do is I get paid out my vacation time. But the legislature was starting to interfere with that as well, to say, well, you know, an employer may not have to do that. So now it's true, and especially in government, what happens is that the employer, i.e. in the case of government, the taxpayer, ends up with this massive liability, because if people can accumulate vacation time over time, it can be a big liability for an employer. And I think in government that's the biggest problem. But in the private sector, what has been tending to happen is people have been forced to take their vacation in the year that they accrue it. So now to say, well, you know, if you may not get your vacation time that you're owed, the government shouldn't be interfering with that. That should be something between the employer and the employee. So we see lots of overstepping of the legislature this time around, and of course lots of different kinds of tax grabs with the gas tax and with the lottery with the lottery. So essentially we've got, just like on the federal side, a government that just has not defined its function. Its spending is control, And this is something that we as voters have got to start looking at a little bit more carefully and paying a bit more attention to at election time.
Well, and then there's part of it. This is why, again, I rely on you guys down at Wyoming Liberty Group and not some of the regular media, because I remember reading something about the tipping legislation, but I really didn't know what it was all about. And that was the most in-depth explanation I've heard so far. And I've worked in restaurants. I grew up on a resort island. Of course, I worked at restaurants when I was a kid. Tipping was something that we just decided what we were going to do. We either had a jar that everybody was going to split up if it was a deli kind of restaurant. But if we were individual waiters at the table, well, whatever we collect is what we collected. In some cases, the management would turn and say, it'd be nice if you were to tip the bus boys a little bit for helping you out, because they do run to the tables with water and stuff like that. But it was all settled in-house. Why in the world would I want legislators to get involved in this? If you really want to talk about the most conservative state, which is what I don't really think we are anymore. I like what actually Tom Lubnow said. It's like being the tallest midget in the room. If we're the most conservative state, really the answer needs to be hands off. I mean, honestly, just don't even touch any of this. Stay out of it and let the employers and employees decide among themselves. So who do we have now in government that's pushing tipping legislation and vacation legislation? Who are these people?
It's Petrov with the tipping legislation, but I'm not sure. I don't now recall who's got anything to do with the vacation legislation.
And where is he from, Petrov?
I can't. It's a woman, actually. I don't remember now where she's from.
Okay. Because immediately when you hear something like that, you think, well, it's got to be Jackson Hole, right? I mean,
possibly. I don't know.
Is there anything else that we have to watch out for besides this?
Well, actually, the other thing I wanted to go through a little bit was some of the problems with this lottery bill. Now, one of the things, there seems to be a lot of confusion about the amount of revenue that the lottery might possibly bring in compared to the amount of money that the government is going to get left to spend. When I was testifying in front of the travel committee on Tuesday, we had one group that's pro-gambling. I mean, we had a couple of lobby groups that were there to promote gambling, because of course they're the ones who are going to benefit from it. One group said, oh, you guys can expect to generate between $80 and $90 million in revenue. And everybody's kind of going, oh. And then another group came and said, no, well, you could expect to get $21 million in revenue. Now that's a little bit closer, but what you need to understand is the difference between revenue and the amount of money that the government is actually going to get. What we've been doing is comparing this HB 77 here, our lottery bill, with a similar lottery in North Dakota. North Dakota has a similar sized population. The lottery that they have is very similar to what's envisioned by HB 77. They generate about $23 million in revenue. And once you eliminate prize payouts, which is about 70% of that, and administration costs, then what you get left over for the government to spend is about $6 million. $6 million, not 21, not 90. And this is even if you look at the fiscal note that's attached to HB 77, you'll see that the Legislative Service Office, so the bureaucracy that calculates all these things, they say that the amount of money we could expect to see would be between 5 and 9 million. So, all of these big revenue projections, people need to so this sort of goes back to this idea about budget cuts. You really have got to understand very carefully what it is the government is talking about, and don't assume, because your definition of budget or your definition of revenue and the government's definition of budget and the government's definition of revenue can often be very, very different. So it's important that everybody define their terms, we're all on the same page, and we're all talking about the same thing, and that way we can sort of figure out what's going on and we can decide what it is we want to do about it.
Okay, are you guys going to come out with any kind of report on this lottery anytime soon on your website?
I'm going to have I'm working on another article right now. That's where I'm sort of reading off my notes here, where I talk about all the different problems. One, of course, is the lack of transparency. And another thing, too, is that, if you look at the legislation, you can see also that this is a bureaucracy that's going to be able to incur debt. Now, I don't know about you, but I get a bit worried when I start hearing that these bureaucracies can incur debt. And because, of course, in fact, I think it was Mike Moser or somebody from the Wyoming State Liquor Association said that, well, this is a lottery is a corporation, it's a separate group. If they start losing money, well, they'll go to business. when have you ever heard of a government organization going out of business? Yeah, it doesn't go out of business.
Yeah, no.
They've incurred debt.
Yeah, they would go into debt.
So it's not going to go out of business. And then it's going to have debt. Who's going to can you say bailout?
Yeah.
It's just bad news all around.
All right. Well, as soon as you've got these articles posted, do me a favor, send me a link, because I'm on that new page that I have. I want to make sure to have a cross link for that, and on my Facebook as well. But go ahead, finish what you were saying.
Yeah. Well, and of course the other thing too is we had a couple of other groups. There was the Retail Association was there, speaking out in favor of the lottery bill, and I spoke to the very nice woman afterwards, and I said, all the data that I've read about the retailers, they don't like lotteries, because what happens is that people come into their little stores, they buy a lottery ticket, which is very low margin for people and for the retailer, and that means they're not buying other things that are higher margin. So in fact, retailers lose money when you have a lottery. And she said, well, this particular kind of lottery, they feel that they would actually generate revenue. And in fact, in the legislation, it says that there's a 6% payment to retailers for when they sell these tickets. So they get 6% of the revenue from these sales. So that also means that that's less money to government to spend on roads or whatever it is they're going to spend on. So if what people are thinking, I think a lot of people that I talk to who support a lottery, really what they're supporting is freeing up some of the gambling legislation that we have here in the state, which is actually very restrictive. If that's what you have in mind, this lottery bill is not the way to go. Its costs are going to be much higher than its benefits. If you look at the difference between what the government brings in it's like I was saying, governments can still cash in on sin, If you look at the difference between the amount of money that the government brings in from cigarette sales, which is a sales tax, and the amount of money the liquor distribution branch brings in, we have $22 million brought in on tobacco tax revenue, and you only have $12 million brought in on liquor revenue. So if what the government has in mind is looking for some kind of cash cow, Wyoming Lottery Corporation is not the way to go. And it's just like, and the problem too, of course, is the liability to taxpayers is probably going to get worse as the years go by.
It strikes me when you say cash cow, that last line suddenly strikes me that, don't you have enough money coming in already? I think we have enough money coming in already, but they're always looking for another way to bring in more revenue, because there's always more projects and there's never an end to these projects. I grew up in Florida, which now has a population of 17 million. So they make a lot of money off of their lottery, and seems to make a lot of sense there. The state is just raking it in on that lottery. But when I look at the population of this state, more and more that I look at it, I think not if it's state run. Maybe if you just said, okay, somebody private can come in and set up something like that. Just allow gambling, since everybody leaves the state to go gambling. Just allow that. Maybe that'd be a better way to go.
Yeah, one of the calculations that they were bantying around was that you'd need 115,000 people here in the state spending between $15 and $16 per week to achieve some of these revenue estimates that these lottery promoters are bantering around. I mean, we've got such a small population here. You would really need to expect every single man, woman, and child to be spending money on the lottery to even come close to some of these revenue projections. It would be much better if the government can't get its spending addiction under control and it wants to benefit off the addictions of other people, then what it needs to do is look at opening up, liberalizing the market and taxing these activities instead of trying to run these things as a government bureaucracy, because that's just a losing proposition.
See, that was a great line. You got to write that one down and use it. I repeat what you just said on a regular basis, because that's a great argument. All right, I got to go play some sports. As soon as you get this stuff posted, again, let me know, because I want to make sure it's on my Facebook page. I want to make sure it's on my website as well, so we can get this information out there, because, again, the irrelevant press across Wyoming just is not getting this information out. Maureen, always great to see you. Thanks for...
Always great to be here.
Dreaming on in.
Thank you. Bye now.